The NHL playoff races are heating up. The Ottawa Senators are trying to break a long playoff drought. The New Jersey Devils trying to hold on despite major injuries. And the Utah Hockey Club is looking for a playoff spot for the first time since moving to Salt Lake. All that and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a familiar face and voice to Locked On NHL listeners and viewers, Ross Levitan of Locked On Senators and Sens Central. And Ross, pretty exciting time for the Ottawa Senators right now. They are winning, and they are winning at the right time.
Yeah, 6 wins in a row, Gil. Appreciate you having me. 7-0-1 in their last 8 games, and that was off of a 5-game losing streak where they fell out of a playoff spot. It feels like ever since their previous 6-game win streak this year, earlier in December, they've been kind of pacing the wild card race. Teams have been within striking distance, and then when that 5-game losing streak happened, 3 divisional losses right before the Four Nations to Tampa twice and Florida. Then out of the Four Nations, you lose another divisional game, wild card race with the Montreal Canadiens, and then the Winnipeg Jets, obviously one of the best teams in the National Hockey League. It was time to take a deep breath, and then they had some winnable games and some games against great teams like Washington, for example. They came back from down 3-0. So I think the best part and the most sustainable part of this win streak for Ottawa, Gil, is that they're doing it in different ways. They've been trailing in games in the third period. They've been down 3-0 to Washington. They get a point out of that one. And then they've had a couple dominant efforts where they never trailed. So they're finding different ways to win. It's a huge sign of maturity for this group. And their top end players are producing. Their depth players feels like they're really clicking on all cylinders right now.
And they're getting wins against the teams they need to beat, beating some of the teams in the playoff race like Boston, or just beating Toronto in a big rivalry game, beating the Rangers earlier in this streak. What does that mean as far as this team's ability to come through in the clutch?
Yeah, it's showing that they can live up to big moments, and it all starts in goal, right? They went out and got Linus Ullmark for this exact reason, to have that big game goalie who can shut things down. You look at the Detroit game from last Monday. They get outshot 48-24, and they win 2-1. Ullmark was outstanding in that game, and he's had his ups and downs, mostly with injuries this season. He was out for almost 2 months at one point with a bad back, but they were able to kind of stay above water, and now he's playing in lights out right now. He looks so good. Made one mistake in the Leafs game where he fumbled a puck out playing it. It goes in the back of the net, and you can tell this is where you know a team's confident. Jake Sanderson after the game said, hey, I was talking with Thomas Chabot on the bench, and we knew after that mistake that he was going to lock in and not let in anything else. And when you have that confidence, even after a bad mistake from your own teammates, that tells you you're in a really good spot. So yeah, it's the way they're winning, the teams they're winning against, and you can see when you pull up the standings, Ottawa's put a little bit of cushion between them and everyone else in the wild card race.
Talk to me about what the Senators did at the trade deadline and how the new players are impacting the team so far.
Yeah, I think what I liked more than the actual trades at the deadline was GM and president of hockey operations Steve Staios' press conference afterwards, where he acknowledged that trading away a core piece like Josh Norris was hard. It's hard to do. He's a great guy. He was actually the last guest we've had on Locked On Sens. We went up to Ottawa and had a great chat with him. He's an awesome guy and a great hockey player, but for the amount of money that he was making and his consistent injury issues that we hope he can find a way to battle through. But like he's already missed the last game with Buffalo since being traded there. Ottawa needed a guy who they could rely on down the middle. And since acquiring Dylan Cousins, they're 5-0-0. They haven't lost a game. Yesterday was or Saturday, I should say, was the first game that Dylan Cousins didn't get a point in. And it just shakes up a comfortable core. And I don't think that the players were feeling like, oh, it doesn't matter. I think this group is really well meaning and really wants to win. That said, you look around and all of a sudden a guy you've gone to battle with for 5 years isn't there anymore. It's like, okay, like, hey, this is a business at the end of the day. And until we start winning consistently, changes are going to happen. Now, I don't think it's that easy as just saying you trade an injured player for a less injured player. With the money they saved, they were then able to go out and add Fabian Zetterlund. Zetterlund's been stuck on the fourth line so far. The line, obviously, they haven't lost since, right? And we know coaches don't like changing a winning lineup, Gil, but I think that you're going to see him down the stretch have moments, like have valuable moments. And I think the Ottawa's fourth line's got the most goals in the league. If you have Zetterland's got 17 and Adam Gaudette's got 16 on the fourth line. So they've added depth. They've added an ability to withstand injuries if they do happen. And I really like what they did, but I even more so like how Steve Staios approached the messaging around the trade deadline.
The old cliche in sports is you're never as bad as you look during a losing streak and never as good as you look during a winning streak. What is your biggest concern about this team as we head into the final stretch drive for the playoffs?
Yeah, I think it would just be, I want to see it consistently against good teams. Like, yes, they've been playing teams around them in the standings, but the game against Toronto was the first playoff team, like in a playoff spot at the time that they met since early February. And I know they obviously didn't play a bunch in February with the Four Nations break, but they'd been playing teams lower in the stand, and that means, I mean, you get the same schedule throughout the year, so they played their harder games a lot earlier on. They've got some big matchups coming up. Like the Montreal Canadiens, not in a playoff spot as of the time of this recording, but they're red hot. They're 7-1-2 in their last 10 games. That's going to be a big game. Then they've got another game coming up against the Colorado Avalanche at home. Like, these are the games where, yeah, you've been impressive. You've won games that you should win. Now go out there and win games against teams that are above you in the standings. They've got Florida later this year. They've got Tampa later this year. I want to see them give the top end teams in the Eastern Conference, and I mean the league too, mentioning Colorado. I want to see them give those teams a tough time, because it's one thing to beat teams around you in the standings. It's another to really put yourself into contender mode and be competitive with those best teams in the league.
And those are the teams you're going to face in the playoffs anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping in Ottawa for a Battle of Ontario. Ottawa just swept the season series against Toronto. Ottawa's won 5 games in Toronto's building. Like, I think that would be the perfect welcome back to the playoffs moment for the Ottawa Senators. I'm not one to get ahead of myself. I'm waiting till that X is next to their name in the playoffs. Gil, you know, we've been doing this together since 2019. I've never covered a playoff game. So I'm being very cautious. I'm being very measured. But if you could ask me to handpick an opponent in the first round, give me the Toronto Maple Leafs.
What would ending this playoff drought mean for the Ottawa Senators, for the fans, for the organization? How big would it be?
It would be enormous. I think as much for the organization, who's just had a huge turnaround with new ownership, new management, new coaching, and the players who have been here, like Brady Tkachuk in particular. He comes in, he's played 500 games now, and he still hasn't played a playoff game. So for him to be able to come in and be in those meaningful games that he thrives so much in at the Four Nations, I think it would mean everything. The fan base is ready. The city's ready. Everything's buzzing around town. Everything's Ottawa Senators, flags in restaurant windows. And this is a team where, I mean, when I grew up from 1997 until 2011, they made the playoffs every single season. You just knew to set your watch. Now, sometimes it would be over in the first round, but sometimes they go to the Stanley Cup final, and you just had that expectation of making playoffs. And I think that's what the ownership and management is trying to get back to. There was a stretch in the 2010s where it was every other year, 2010, 2012, 13, 15, 17. They want to be more consistent than that. And I think that's where a sign of things to come will be, if they can make it this year and then come out of the gate hot again next year.
Ross, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, you can find us, Brandon Pillars, my co-host. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find us over at Sens Central and Locked On Senators, available everywhere you get podcasts, including on YouTube, where we are 35 subscribers away from 10,000. So help us get to that road to 10K. Gil, always appreciate you and look forward to another great week on Locked On NHL. The playoff run, like the final stretch, is here, and there's no better time with the weather getting nicer. It's light out later. It's the best time of year to be a hockey fan. So thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks, Ross. Always a pleasure. Today's episode is brought to you by Factor. Eating healthy doesn't have to be complicated. With Factor, you get chef-made, dietitian-approved meals that are ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes, so you can fuel your body without the hassle of cooking. Factor meals arrive fresh, never frozen, and with 40 options across 8 dietary preferences each week, you can customize your menu to fit your goals, whether that's Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. I love how Factor keeps you on track with healthy, delicious meals without the time-consuming prep. The Korean beef bowl and creamy Parmesan chicken are some of my favorites. They taste homemade, but take no effort. Factor also offers smoothies, breakfasts, and snacks, so you can always have something nutritious ready to go. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Devils, Trey Matthews. And Trey, a challenging time right now for the Devils. They've been in a good position most of the season, but now in the stretch run for the playoffs without their best player, Jack Hughes. What are the keys to this team overcoming this big loss?
I also want to add on to that, Gil. Dougie Hamilton, he is set to miss the rest of the year. He is arguably the Devils' best offensive-minded defenseman. And Jonas Siegenthaler is also going to miss the rest of the season. He is the Devils' best defensive-minded defenseman. And he was having a pretty solid showing this year. Losing all three of those players is a big blow for more reasons than one. And now you see a situation where the Devils lost their star player in Jack Hughes for the second straight year, where he has to get season-ending shoulder surgery. So the circumstance is unique, because you would think, with how negative people have been talking about the Devils, you'd think that they'd be out of the playoff hunt or that they're in preparation for the offseason. Well, that's not really the case. They're still third in the Metro, and they have a few points to play with. Not many, but a few. So they're still in a prime playoff position, but obviously without Jack Hughes, it leaves a lot of question marks. But I think the big thing for the Devils is they gotta win consistently. Prior to Saturday's matchup against the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Devils were actually on a 3-game winning streak without Jack Hughes. And the Devils have one of the easiest schedules to close out the regular season. So I think if this did have to happen, I guess at least it happened at this particular time period where the Devils can try to pick up some winnable games so that way they can at least get to the playoffs. My goal for the Devils coming into the season, playoffs or bust, because it doesn't matter if they get knocked out of the first round. If they make it to the playoffs, that's an improvement from last year.
You mentioned the 3 key players who are out of the lineup. Who are some of the guys that need to step up? I mean, you can't pick up all of the slack most likely, but who needs to step up to get this team to the promised land?
There's a couple players that come to mind. The first is going to be Jesper Bratt, because he is going to be the one in which the Devils rely heavy when it comes to points. And he actually just tied Scott Stevens' single season assist record. Scott Stevens had 60 assists that was back during the 1993-1994 season, which was the franchise record for most assists in a single year. Jesper Bratt just tied that, and with plenty of games remaining, knock on wood, as long as he stays healthy, Jesper Bratt's going to break that record. So there's that. And also Timo Meier. Some people are a little divided when it comes to Timo Meier. They want the same production that he put up with the San Jose Sharks. But the thing is like, when Timo Meier is out there, when he's chugging down that lane, he's creating a lot of good offensive attempts for New Jersey. So I'm going to look at Timo Meier. And then on the defensive side of things, I'm going to look for Jack's little brother, Luke, because Luke has actually been having a pretty good year offensively and defensively. He's elevated his game in more ways than one, and he's going to have to take a lot on his shoulders because now he is going to be the one in which the Devils rely on to create offense on the back end. So I'm looking at Luke Hughes to elevate the Devils on the blue line. He did it during the playoffs a couple years ago when Ryan Graves went down with his respective injuries. So I think those are the players that come to mind of who needs to elevate their game now that we're missing some key guys.
Talk to me a little bit about Cody Glass. 4 points in his first 4 games with the Devils. What has he meant, and what is his role coming down the stretch?
The thing about Cody Glass is, like, if I'm being completely honest, this kind of production is not sustainable for a player of his caliber. But I'm glad that he's fitting in with the Devils. The main goal for Glass is to give the Devils more depth. That was the name of the game heading into the trade deadline, and he was traded away from Pittsburgh in exchange for Chase Stillman, Max Graham, and a 3rd-round pick in the 2027 draft. So basically, the Devils traded away a few years ago. Since you cover the Islanders, I'll jog your memory. The Devils essentially traded away Kyle Palmieri and Travis Zajac for Cody Glass now a few years later, if people could put the dots together. But the thing for Cody Glass is that he's brought primarily to give the Devils some more offensive production on the bottom 6, which has been one of their biggest Achilles heels. But like I said, I'm not expecting for Cody Glass to be a point per game player because I don't think that's in his repertoire. But I'm glad that he's fitting in nicely with the Devils. He's been very impressive.
You know, before this season, goaltending was considered a big issue, and yet this year, Devils are 5th in the league right now in goals allowed. How important has the goaltending been? And talk to me about the performance of the goalies.
It's been one of the few areas in which the fans really have little to no complaints, which is so weird to say because the last few years, that's all that fans have complained about, saying this Devils team could be a playoff caliber unit or they could be scarier if they had decent goaltending. And getting Jacob Markstrom in the offseason, bringing back Jake Allen, Nico Dawes, he had a great showing in the 5 games he played in to replace the injured Jacob Markstrom. It's been phenomenal. And also another name I'm going to throw out there, I've seen him play at Boston University, Mike Yegorov, one of the top goalies in last year's draft. In fact, he was the number 1 ranked goalie in North America. So the future is bright when it comes to Devils goaltending, but focusing on the now, Jacob Markstrom, he's a little rusty coming back from injury. I'm sure he'll come back in more ways than one, but he's a little rusty right now. And in that game against Pittsburgh, I think that was evident as to how bad he's been ever since coming back from injury, but I'm not really concerned about that. Jake Allen, he's been having a good year. I think he's still tied for 2nd most shutouts in the NHL. And Nico Dawes, let me tell you something, Gil. 5 games, he had a goals against average below 1, a .966 save percentage, and 1 shutout in the few games he played in this year because he was back up to Jake Allen when Jacob Markstrom went down with his injury. So I have a lot of high praise for Nico Dawes. Right now he's in Utica because he's the only goalie that can be sent down with no repercussions. But the goaltending has been great, Gil, and it's one of the few areas in which I have no complaints about, which is weird to say because the Devils have been struggling when it comes to goaltending ever since Martin Brodeur retired many, many years ago.
How important is it for this team to make the playoffs this year? I mean, you talked about playoffs or bust when the season started with all the injuries and with the way this team is developing. How critical is it to make it this year?
It's very critical because the Devils didn't make it last year, and the year prior to last year, they set a franchise record for most wins in a single season, and that's a team that's won 3 Stanley Cups. With the amount of talent they have on their roster, there's no reason why they should be this team where they make the playoffs, they miss the playoffs, they make the playoffs, they miss the playoffs. I'm well past the excuses saying that the Devils are young, they'll learn, they'll figure it out, because the reality of it is you got players like Jesper Bratt and Nico Hischier. Yes, they are young in age, they're in their 20s, but they have nearly 10 years of NHL experience, if you could believe it. Jack Hughes, he has a decent amount of years under his belt. Eric Haula, he has NHL playoff experience. Andre Palat, he's won a couple cups. Same with Jake Allen, few others like Paul Cotter, Curtis McDermott. They've played on championship teams. I'm well past the excuse that the Devils are young, inexperienced. No, you got to try to work with what you got, because sooner or later that window is going to get smaller, smaller, and smaller.
Trey, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
You can find Locked On Devils wherever you get your podcast from, both free on streaming services and YouTube. And you can find me on X at TreyMat4 or the show's X page at Locked On Devils. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
All right, Trey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shells variety. It's the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days. Whether I'm snacking at my desk, on a road trip, or just need a quick protein boost, they're always my go-to. And if you love cracking open every shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. That's wonderfulpistachios.com. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Well, between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place so you can stop managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch, I realized just how much I was spending on food delivery. Now I budget smarter and save more. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you could use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. It is great to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Utah HC, Robyn Leano. And Robyn, a big win Sunday for Utah HC as they not only get a win, but beat one of the teams they're battling for those playoff spots. What was the key to this victory?
You know, I think it's interesting because the Utah Hockey Club they have been on a bigger momentum run. I mean, they'll have a couple of bad games sprinkled in there, but ever since the Four Nations, this team has looked a lot better. They have built a little bit more consistency in them. I think to them, getting a win like against Vancouver, to them, it's no matter what happens, battling through maybe some adversity, that this team remains resilient. And that's kind of what they did. I mean, they were down early, and they only allowed that one goal. You know, the only goal that they allowed by Vancouver, that was all it is. And then 3 unanswered. One was a empty netter, which however you want to take it. But hey, a 3-1 victory against a team who is right up there in the thick of the wild card race. That is the important kind of wins you want to see from the Utah Hockey Club.
And what you talked about, since Four Nations, they've played better. What has been the key to that success?
I don't want to sound cliche, Gil, but I'm going to say it. this team is healthy. This is the healthiest Utah Hockey Club team we have seen all season. Yeah, I think I do believe they just lost one of their players for a little bit. I'm trying to remember their name. It's escaping my head right now. It's coming back from vacation, but this team has had almost no defense through the majority of this season. They had to just punch in and kind of call up or plug in these random pieces off of waiver wires, off of trades, off of other pickups, or whatever it was, because John Marino wasn't in earlier in this season, because Sean Durzi went out with an injury, because Robert Bortuzzo went out with an injury. And even one of the players that replaced them early on in the season, and Maverick Lamoureux, he went out with an injury for a little bit before they got sent down. So they tried to plug in a bunch of these players. They brought in Oli Mata. They brought in Nick DeSimone. They brought in other guys. And then John Marino comes back. Sean Durzi comes back, which was, I think, the biggest key about there. But all of a sudden, we're seeing a top four of Mikhail Sergachev with John Marino and Oli Mata with Sean Durzi, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, that's an incredible top four. A healthy team is what really this team needs.
We've been talking about this team, since they were in Arizona, and there's always been a lot of high draft picks and young prospects. And talk to me about some of these players who are starting to actually come into their own right now.
Yeah, it's really cool to see, and I know even say it, everyone knows this player's name at this point, but just seeing Dylan Guenther absolutely dominate this league right now. He's got a hot stick. Yeah, there's no other way to say it. He had a hot stick earlier this season. He cooled off a little bit, kind of like somewhere there in November, December. That was Utah Hockey Club's low point of the year. They weren't playing well as a whole, so you can't really fault Dylan Guenther for that. But he kept picking things back up. You would see some of the best kind of play. I think early in February, he had an incredible one-time on an overtime win, and we're seeing some other one-time opportunities that he gets out there. Logan Cooley is heating up and showing that, hey, he's one of those kinds of players, and it really shows this team in about a year, 2 years down the road, they are going to be incredible.
Talk to me about Clayton Keller. 74 points in 65 games coming into tonight. He is by far their best offensive weapon.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Keller had, over the course of the season, no doubt about it, has been the best offensive player, as you mentioned, on this team. But he had a couple of dry periods, and the games in which he would get a stretch of really good games always happened to have been right after, or beginning at, and then right after in the games following, whenever they played against the St. Louis Blues. So when we're talking about Clayton Keller, it's funny because he's a kid from St. Louis. Anytime he goes to St. Louis, he plays his best game. It's really weird. But also you don't fault a kid for playing his best game in front of maybe his hometown kid friends or whatever it might be. But games following after that, he plays his best kinds of hockey. Sometimes he'll go through dry stretches, as I mentioned, but those games he plays better. He's been getting better since then, and I feel like the other aspect of our Adgil is the Sens Four Nations, because there's probably a chip on his shoulder for being snubbed out of the Four Nations roster, which I feel like a lot of other American hockey fans, whether they're an Arizona or Utah hockey fan or wherever they're from, or St. Louis, most people can agree that was probably one of the biggest snubs out of that roster.
And yet it may have benefited the Utah Hockey Club more than anything. So little irony there. What are the keys for Utah HC to stay in the playoff race and maybe even make the playoffs this year?
I think to them, it's just take each game, treat them like a playoff game, each game like a playoff game one. And I know that sounds cliche, but again, a lot of things I say right now are cliche, but hey, at this point, you got to buy into it, right? You're going to buy into what they're trying to sell. And I think that too, this team can't lose confidence. They're riding on an incredible amount of confidence right now, and it seems that they're building it. And the most confident team I've seen in a long time. They need to keep that going, because I've seen games in which this team is consistently inconsistent. We will see moments in which they look like they're an AHL team out there, and I wonder, where did this team come from? Because just the other day they were beating a Stanley Cup caliber team. So they need to keep the confidence up and keep the consistency, because at this point in the season, it's only heating up, and they're going up against consistently playoff level teams for this final stretch. They want to get in. They need to get those wins, not just get those 2 points, but they need to do it convincingly. They needed to do it in regulation, because that's what matters.
Yeah, those 3-point games are a killer to come down the stretch, no question. How big of an impact has this move made for this franchise?
It's been incredible. I take a look at what this team has done, and I feel like it's built a lot of I think that's part of it, of what's helped this confidence for this team, is because they don't have a cloud looming over their head anymore of anything happening outside of the hockey world, or anything happening in the business world, because now they have a owner who's stable, who has the arena. They already have that taken care of, and they're being treated. They're also being treated well. That's another thing. But B, it's an owner that's also willing to open up their pocketbook and being like, hey, I'm willing to pay these guys money and keep the guys I want to keep, and like allow you to pay these guys to keep who you want to keep, but also stay on the same timeline. We're not going to rush you. We're not going to force you into like, hey, we want to win now. We know what you're doing. We know you're building this team. So I feel like everyone's buying into how Ryan and Ashley Smith are trying to run this team. Chris Armstrong, the president of Hockey Ops, is trying to run this team, and Bill Armstrong is trying to build this team as the general manager. I think all of it working all well super together. You can really see it on the ice.
All right, going to be an exciting finish to this season. Robyn, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, the podcast you can find just about everywhere on social media. We are on the app formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, at LO_NHL Utah. You can find me personally at Robyn, it's with a Y, _LEANO. I'm also on Blue Sky at Robyn Ice Time. You can find Tom Callahan, my co-host. He is on X occasionally, very seldomly, but he's at Callahan on air. He is mostly on Blue Sky. You can follow him at Tom Talks.
All right, Robyn, thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. For your next listen, check out Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. It's available on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and it's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guests, Ross Levitan of Locked On Ottawa Senators, Trey Matthews of Locked On New Jersey Devils, and of course, Robyn Leano of Locked On Utah Hockey Club for joining us today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we're here 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, bringing you the biggest stories in the hockey world. So make sure you subscribe and join us each day for the latest. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.